When you have obsessive compulsive disorder, like I do, your life has a lot of rules. Don't step on that sidewalk crack. You're not sitting even, you have to fix that. Fix it, hold your breath, don't eat that, it's poison, it's probably poison. Do that 4 more times, and another 4 times, and 4 more times just to be safe. When you have OCD, you either follow the rules or you pay really dearly. And, well, I've never been much of a rebel. I structured my life around compensating for my illness. See, I was diagnosed with OCD my sophomore year of high school. The moment that title was spoken to me, my narrative was permanently, irrevocably shifted. It was like this new thread had been added to every single memory I'd ever had. My excessive nightmares as a kid, my problems with chewing incorrectly, or being touched unexpectedly. Everything was a symptom. When I finally started to face my OCD and heal from it, I hoped that that would bring me the purpose and peace that I had so longed for. But it actually just started to control me in a new way. In my head, my narrative became one of equal parts shame and martyrdom. It was this rotten secret that I just felt doomed to carry around. I couldn't tell anyone about it because I was so scared of being labeled as a self-pitier. I was afraid that the misunderstanding of other people would actually change my narrative and make me the one at fault. But I also couldn't let go of it. It was like my guilty pleasure to be the protagonist of my own story. All I had to do was narrate my poetic struggle in my head, and somehow maybe that would give me some kind of special meaning. I became this tragic hero obsessed with my own suffering, and that was exactly the way I wanted it. I read a book this year on narrative psychology called The Stories We Live by Dan P. McAdams. In the opening chapter, McAdams says that humans use stories to, quote, live well, with unity and purpose, and that, quote, the good life is justified by the good story. I realized that's exactly what I was doing. I was using my OCD and the quote-unquote good story that I got from it to make my life into something that was somehow purposeful and good. I think a lot of times we try to retroactively shape our lives into something meaningful, instead of actually living that out in our day-to-day lives. It reached a point for me where my narrative started to overwhelm who I actually wanted to be. You see, I thought I knew who I was. Sylvia, to me, was a girl with certainty. She liked films and she dressed to the nines. She was smart and often pretentious. She had a million allergies and a crippling mental disorder. These were the set pieces that I used to define myself. Regardless of how true they were or weren't, I was the idea I had built and the opinion everybody else had of me. I was whatever the story dictated. When I started Capstone this year with this unforgiving blueprint of myself and only the vague idea to study storytelling, I had pretty much no idea that I would end up in a room full of people telling my most vulnerable secret. But at the beginning, I just wanted to know what was beautiful about stories and how they connected us. I knew they were important and pervasive, but I just didn't quite get the fullness of them yet. I didn't become interested in narrative and identity until I read my Capstone book this year. The Stories We Live By introduced me to the idea that humans, quote, make ourselves through myth. This is the central idea in the field of narrative psychology, that the stories we tell actually determine who we are as people. It was counter to everything I'd ever been taught. We're supposed to have experiences that shape us and then tell people about it, not the other way around. But it resonated so deeply with me that I felt like it almost had to be true. I remember in particular I was fixated on this one story he tells in an early chapter about a woman who felt abused by nuns at the orphanage she grew up in. It follows her as she tries to redeem her story by kind of trying to raise her own daughter better. And it ultimately culminates in this moment where she and her teenage daughter break into an abandoned chapel and desecrate it. It kind of completes this rebellion against these people who hurt her. He closes it by saying, I believe that hers will always be a tragic myth. There were 2 things that struck me about that statement. Half of it was the word tragedy. Like, in the literary sense, tragedy usually means madness and bloodshed. Think Macbeth, think Oedipus, think Romeo and Juliet. It's not usually so ordinary. The other part of it that struck me was just the definitiveness with which he said it. Hers will always be a tragic myth. It felt like a condemnation, like her narrative was already sealed. No need to wait for it to be over. No need for her to do something dramatic like stab her eyes out like Oedipus. Her ending was already decided. It sparked a lot of questions in me, like, which one is my life? Is it a tragedy or is it a comedy? How does it become that way? Is it from the story details or from the storyteller? And I guess most importantly, I wondered, am I stuck too? How many of the important cards have I already played? What am I allowed to take back? What do I get to choose? I started asking these questions at a time in my life where I was really doubting everything that I knew to be true about myself. After a really intense summer in New York, I scrapped all my dreams of going to film school, and I started wondering about my friendships and myself and my purpose. I wasn't certain of anything anymore. I remember a moment at the beginning of this year where I was telling a story to my mom, and she stopped me and she was like, "Wait, but I thought so-and-so wasn't very nice." And I told her, "Mom," in what I'm sure was a very impatient tone, "you have to understand that I'm a completely unreliable narrator. It changes all the time based on what's going on or what I'm feeling or what I know." It's funny, I've thought almost endlessly about that statement since. It was like in one phrase I had accidentally summed up all my tangled myths and conflicting selves. Even in the way I was observing and processing my daily life, I was unreliable. But I think there's a kind of magnificent potential in that too. Like the moment I said that, I was suddenly set free of this idea of singular truth within myth. Of course, the story as it happens will always be one thing. We can't change the events as they occur. But the story as it's experienced, as it's felt and packaged and retold, that story is wonderfully fluid. Because if we're the unreliable narrators, that means we get to pick and choose what details we keep in and what we leave out. Do we tell about the nuns and the church destroying? Do we make it a tragedy? If we're the unreliable narrators, we choose that ending. That woman, she already decided her ending before it was even over. So who are we to enslave ourselves to the happenings? Like our perspectives and emotions and personal interactions with circumstance do not mean infinitely more than what strictly happened. Who are we to put our hands up and surrender? I guess this is what I am. I guess this is what my life will be. So many of us fail to recognize the actual themes of our lives. So the moment I noticed this naturally, it became the thing I wanted to study next. I actually got the opportunity this year to teach a J term. Over the course of 5 days, we talked a lot about the self as the narrator, unreliable or otherwise. On the last day, I had everyone in my class tell a story about themselves. The goal was to pay attention to theme. You were supposed to intentionally weave it into your story and listen for it in everyone else's, looking for repetitions and key words. I remember Amber went first. She told a pretty standard happy story. On paper, it was just a silly little story about getting a dog as a kid. If anything, I'd say it seemed chock full of unnecessary details and kind of unfocused bunny trails. But then we kind of started to notice patterns in it. Like when she mentioned breakfast for the first time, it just felt like a speed bump on the way to the dog. But when she mentioned dinner that night, for next to no reason, it started to seem like a communion of sorts. Like to Amber, a meal meant warmth and fullness and the stable American family. As she continued, she mentioned her brother multiple times, and she talked about her parents in ways like, it was before the divorce, and I remember they were getting along in the car that day. The narrative began to take its full shape, and suddenly this run-of-the-mill dog story was actually about family and safety and stability. If I'm being perfectly honest, I normally would have zoned out on it and missed the message entirely. But as I started listening to the implicit messages and accidental rhythms in her story, it became something I could connect to on a really basic but deeply human level. It was a moment of epiphany for me. I started to understand that people are telling us vital and vulnerable parts about themselves almost constantly. In everything from our speech patterns to our pithy observances, we are using stories to let ourselves be known. All anyone has to do is pay attention. It's especially funny when we think we know our own stories so well. I went last because I was pretty sure I knew how mine would end up. I told a story that marked the beginning of my long journey with OCD. It was about waking up in the middle of the night and suddenly finding myself afraid of my left hand. I remember holding it up in the moonlight, and suddenly it just looked so sickly and alien, and I shoved it under my covers and waited for my dad to wake up. Now, there were themes everyone was supposed to pick up on in my story. Like everyone was supposed to notice my dad and the family and security that he represented. And they were supposed to notice the nightlight, the safety of the light. What they were really supposed to hear was this tragedy of a little girl who never grew out of her fear of the dark. And they did notice those things. They kind of, followed the little cookie crumbs that I left for them. But what really caught me off guard were the things they noticed that I didn't put in my story on purpose. I remember Carly excitedly checking her notes and saying, "I think it's really exciting that you're telling this story that foreshadows your fear of the dark and has lots of light and dark imagery." But you're not actually afraid of the dark at all in this story. You're afraid of yourself. Now, I take pride in my analytical skills, my trained self-awareness. But out of all the stories I've ever told, all the stories I've ever read, all the stories I've ever shared, suddenly Carly heard this one, and she finally recognized the antagonist. It was me. I was the thing in the way of my own redemption. In a lot of ways, I think that narrative's been present in every story I've ever told. Me as the protagonist, me as the antagonist. For so long, I've only understood my story at face value. Like it's about my likes and dislikes, my passions and my activities. If an enemy was to be named, it was me versus my fear. I never saw myself on the other side of that equation. It reminds me of a Bible verse a friend told me a couple weeks ago that really resonates with this. 2 Timothy 1:7, it says, "For God has not given us a spirit of fear, but of power, love, and self-discipline." That is the story I want to be telling for the rest of my life. My story is one of power, it's one of love, it's one of self-discipline. My narrative of fear does not need to be a prevalent theme anymore. It reminds me of a book we read last year in AP Lang. It was called The Things We Carried by Tim O'Brien. It's fiction. It's about the Vietnam War, technically, but he asks a lot of questions about truth and identity and how we tell the right story. It's interesting, though, out of all the war stories he tells, in the last chapter he actually takes a step back and tells a story from his childhood about a girl he loved when he was 9 years old and tragically lost. As he tells it, he starts to see that heartbreak and that loss of innocence in every story he's ever told. "I'm skimming across the surface of my own history," he says. "And when I take a high leap into the dark and come down 30 years later, I realize it's as Tim, trying to save Timmy's life with a story." According to Tim O'Brien, the story, not the life, is the saving thing. You see, we tend to look at our lives in terms of dramatic, defining moments. It's this turn left philosophy, like we think we're formed in the big decisions we make. This is where I could have changed. Here is where I could have been a different person. If only I hadn't done this. If only I hadn't said this to that person. If only I hadn't had OCD, or hated myself, or grown up, or done a million other tragic things. Maybe then. Maybe not. Maybe I'm a little bit more like Tim, and I wasn't made in the war. He knows love long before he ever knows torment. I think that has to mean something. I think that has to be at least a little bit like me. And maybe I'm cheating on it all right now. Maybe I'm saving myself with a story in front of you. I've broken the cycle after it all. I've let you in all in on my rotten little secret. I've used this audience here to pull its venom out of my veins and say, look who has the power now. Look who's controlling the narrative right now. It isn't you anymore. This is my power. This is my love. This is my self-discipline. I was not made for your fear. A couple years ago in London, I had a moment exiting the airport where I noticed the cobblestone streets. The compulsion with those is that I either don't step on the sidewalk cracks or avoid any other gaps in the pavement, or I have to hold my breath. It's punishing everywhere, but especially in a place like that. I remember thinking to myself, I could either waste this entire week looking at my feet, or I could break the rules just this once, just for a week. I don't know where it came from, but suddenly I clenched my fists, fingernails deep in my palms, and I looked up. Today, I don't have to keep telling the story of my OCD and of my fear in everything that I say. I can tell you anything I want right now. Like yesterday, I woke up early enough in the morning to have tea for breakfast. And last night, I looked at baby photos with my dad instead of working on my speech. I can't communicate that freedom to you, except to say it's the feeling of stepping willfully on a sidewalk crack. My skin crawled at it once, but now I take a deep breath, in and out, and I face forward.